From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Well, welcome to Rendezvous with History. My name is Anthony Eames, and I am the Director of Scholarly Initiatives at the Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. And I am very pleased to be joined by Luke A. Nichter, the author of the wonderfully provocative and compelling book, The Year That Broke Politics. And let me just pick it up here to read the subtitle, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968, available anywhere you purchase your books, Amazon, Yale University Press, no longer Borders around, I suppose, but Barnes & Noble. Luke is the James Cavanaugh Professor of Presidential Studies at Chapman University, as well as a Professor of History. Luke, pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, sir. Pleasure to be here.
Well, you are one of our first guests on Rendezvous with History, and you have a lot to share with us. This book doesn't so much as move history along incrementally or kind of nudge the needle forward. You totally upend the conventional narrative of what happened in 1968. Can you share with me a little bit first, before we go about debunking the conventional narrative? What is the conventional narrative in 1968?
Well, obviously, there's a lot we could talk about in terms of, the nation was so divided at home due to the Vietnam War and unrest on our campuses around the world. It was really a year of revolution, not just in the United States, but the student movement around Europe, the Cultural Revolution in China, apartheid in South Africa, and then, as I said, 500,000 troops deployed to Southeast Asia. So I think the conventional wisdom is really that it was a year of revolution, and that it was a very close election, one of our closest elections in modern U.S. history, where Nixon defeats Hubert Humphrey by about 500,000 votes in the popular vote. The Electoral College is a little more decisive than that, and that Nixon used a kind of cynical Southern strategy, as it's been called, to steal, or at least perhaps improperly win that election that year from Humphrey, who was known to be a very honorable person, very well liked, very much part of the Democratic establishment. So I think that kind of sets up an election that takes place in the midst of historic divisions at home as well as around the world.
And there's a lot of players in this election. Surprisingly enough, what you say, the man who lives largest probably in the election season is not actually on the ballot, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Do me a favor for our listeners, sketch out the main cast of characters as you do in the book, chapter by chapter. You do an excellent job giving kind of character sketches of those running for office and then the elephant in the room.
Yeah, so this is not meant to be a blow-by-blow day-to-day of the campaign. It's really meant to be more of a 50-year retrospective in terms of what's new, what's newly released in archives, what do we know today that we didn't know just a few years ago. And so the book really focuses on what I call, the four major characters, are the three that are actually on the ballot. So you have then Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who goes on to become the Democratic nominee that year. You have, as we knew him then, former Vice President Richard Nixon, who goes on to become the Republican nominee. You have the former and future Alabama Governor George Wallace, who is really running his first kind of 50-state campaign after kind of dipping his toe in the water in 1964, and really, I think, gravitates around a message that goes beyond Alabama and the South in terms of its appeal. And then looming very largely, kind of looking over all their shoulders, as you said, is outgoing President Lyndon Johnson, who dramatically withdraws from the campaign on March 31st on television. I think thinks about getting back in the race a couple different times, but I think ultimately, most books treat Johnson as a lame duck or irrelevant after March 31st. And you can imagine, at that point, the media attention shifts to the challengers. What Johnson's trying to salvage his remaining legacy. And what I tell is really a different story, that that Johnson he simply shifts his political energy from the ballot to his own legacy and influencing the choice of his successor, because he begins to care an awful lot about how he's going to be treated in history. And so those are kind of the central four characters that I follow while focusing on why the American people ultimately voted the way they did that year.
Well, let's start with Johnson, because he is a huge figure in this book, and he's a huge figure in kind of studies of the 1960s, especially the Vietnam War. I think the kind of major accounts of the Vietnam War, in fact, largely blame Johnson for being kind of an egomaniac.
Yeah.
And in some ways, you do the same thing in suggesting that legacy really starts to dominate his thinking in that kind of final year in office, something that is not, altogether unusual. But Lyndon Johnson, interesting character in how his own views of the race evolve, how he sees the race. I think you have a great quote here right before the convention, where he tells Humphrey, kind of, don't misunderstand, there's no two ways about it. I could get the delegates at the convention if I wanted to, so fall in line. So give me a sense of who Johnson was, his upbringing, his rise to political prominence, and also his, frankly, bitter disagreements with pretty much every other major figure in the Democratic Party.
Well, I think, I suppose people assume that we've already thoroughly explored Lyndon Johnson at this point, but I think he really deserves more attention. And I say that because it's been 20 or 25 years since any big book on Johnson. An awful lot's been released to the Johnson Library in terms of new evidence. His rich White House tapes have really never been used by a biographer yet. Johnson is a fascinating figure. And I lived on the faculty at Texas A&M. I lived kind of on the edge of Johnson country for about 13 years. And I really came to appreciate him. Some people will say, well, he was crude, he was rude, he was raunchy at times.
You hear the stories.
And I think that's why I like him in a sense, because I think these days, it doesn't matter what your politics are. It's so rare that you hear what a politician really thinks about an issue. And I feel like Johnson is authentic. There's an authenticity to Johnson that's different than other presidents. And, you really get a sense for how much of a compromise he was. Northerners didn't consider him to be one of them. And I say this because, of course, during the whole Cold War period, the Democratic coalition was this uneasy alliance between the Northern liberals and the Southern conservatives. And Johnson really wasn't either. If you ask either what Johnson was, they wouldn't claim him. Johnson, I think, was really sort of, I remember talking to Lucy Baines Johnson about this. He's really Southwestern. And you think about what that means when he's born in 1908 in Gillespie County. And that's about as far west as you can go in the country. Arizona and New Mexico are not yet states. California is kind of something different. And he was a bit of kind of a combination of kind of borderlands, Southern, Western. His Lady Bird was really the true Southerner, because she was born in far kind of East Texas, almost near the Louisiana border. And she had a different accent. He would sometimes send her on campaign swings into the Deep South because she resonated, with Southerners. So I think he was really, as he reached national leadership in the Democratic Party in the Senate in the 1950s as party leader, as Senate majority leader, I think he was consistently a compromise. And by being a compromise, he wasn't entirely loved by either one of the halves of that bloc, in the Senate, the Democrats. But he was kind of a Southerner who kind of governed like a Northerner. I mean, he was that combination. And I think people often forget that, they look at Washington and they look at political parties and political talking points, and they forget that an awful lot happens in this town for personal selfish reasons. And I think presidents, when they begin to think about legacy, they're much more concerned about themselves than they are a party or a majority, or do we keep the House or do we keep the Senate or what happens? They're really looking for their own place in history. And at some point, before the 1968 election, Johnson really turns his attention, more toward legacy. And while he was so close to the liberal wing of the party in 1964, he was very proud to have Hubert Humphrey come on his ticket. And this is the height of the Civil Rights era, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, and lots of other, Great Society landmark pieces of legislation.
Which you credit a lot to Humphrey.
Well,
and negotiating out through the House.
And Humphrey, I think, hasn't really gotten his due. I mean, Humphrey was the floor manager of Civil Rights Act of 64. If anybody knows anything about that bill, it's that LBJ signed it in the rotunda, around July 4th. And Humphrey was the one. I mean, you talk to the Humphrey staffers and they talk about, they studied all of the uncommitted senators and they figured out where did the wives shop. They figured out, what church did they go to? Where do their kids go to school? I mean, they studied the personal habits of these uncommitted senators and figured out, when do I call them at home? What's the right gesture in order to bring them over to our side, to get the legislation across the finish line. And Hubert Humphrey and his staff did a lot of that work. I mean, Johnson was kind of at one remove. And so you get, because of the war, what you have is by say 66, the midterms were terrible for Democrats in 66. Mm-hmm. So the Democrats won in a landslide over Barry Goldwater in 64. And then in 66, they had basically lost everything they won in 64. They still controlled the House, the Senate, but not at the kind of supermajority levels that they did before. Certainly not what FDR did at his peak, like in 1936, where Republicans were down to 17 senators, in the upper chamber. And so Johnson is criticized by his own party for Vietnam, increasingly by 66, but also, I would call it kind of negative consequences of the Great Society. I mean, every indicator of crime is rising, racial tension. Themes that we would recognize in recent years, in this country since 2020, all the red lights were blinking for Johnson by 68, but yet, the rules were different then. The McGovern Commission didn't change the rules for nominating a president until 72, when McGovern was the nominee. In 68, you didn't really need to enter any primaries. Humphrey didn't. You didn't need to have a debate. You didn't, basically all the delegates owed their loyalty to Johnson and then to Humphrey, because Humphrey ran in his place. All the state and county chairmen owed their loyalty in one way or another. And so I think Johnson did have, to the point you made earlier, Johnson did have the support of the party apparatus to become nominated. The question is, would he have won? But I think Johnson did have that support, and plenty of new evidence that's in the book shows that he just didn't have it in him to run for a variety of reasons, and ultimately shifted his energy instead to influencing the choice of his successor.
So there's a few interesting points about who he wants to be the successor. One person we know he doesn't want to be the successor is Robert Kennedy. And Johnson and Kennedy, Johnson and Camelot, real tension there. I mean, it seems that in many ways, the story you lay out in the book is that the twin assassinations of 68, King and Kennedy, are pivotal in the election, in part because of how it changes Johnson's calculus toward Humphrey. Can you tell me a little bit about, Johnson and Camelot? What are the underlying tensions there, and how does that shape the elections?
Oh, I think Johnson and Camelot, you'd probably have to go back to at least maybe 56. I mean, Johnson was the one who had earned his time in D.C. since 1937, coming to Congress in a special election. Kennedy was a young upstart, class of 46, along with Nixon, John Davis Lodge. Gerald Ford was 48. I mean, this kind of returning veteran class of politicians that all came back from the wartime service. Johnson predated that. So Johnson was kind of an old timer in the party by 60. And I think many party regulars thought that he had earned his place, but the Kennedys had enthusiasm. They had good looks, they had money, they had campaign organization. And I think probably the discord between the Kennedys and Johnson went back to 56 or 60, when they probably didn't want Johnson on the ticket in 60 as Kennedy's running mate, John F. Kennedy's running mate. But it was a necessary political marriage in order to secure the South, where the Kennedys were not particularly popular. And so it was a political marriage, which is certainly not unique in 60 to Kennedy and Johnson. In terms of U.S. history. But I think there really, I wouldn't say there was love lost. There was never love. It was, it was a political marriage. And so by 68, I would say, Johnson was reacting to events just like Americans in 68. I mean, almost every month of that year, events unfolded that were completely unpredictable. The month before, whether it be the seizure of the Pueblo by North Korea, the Tet Offensive, Johnson almost losing to Eugene McCarthy in the New Hampshire primary. Then, as you said, the assassination of Martin Luther King in April, Kennedy in June, the Paris peace talks beginning in May. I mean, every single month, there's some dramatic headline, domestic policy, foreign policy, some event around the world. And I think Johnson was reacting to these. There's nothing static about Lyndon Johnson. I think after he withdraws from the ballot on March 31st, I think he saw that his ideal successor probably was liberal Republican Nelson Rockefeller of New York, because I think they were more or less in sync on domestic policy. I think Johnson makes 3 different attempts to get him to run in 68, and he's kind of uncommitted. He's in, he's out. Rockefeller makes this funny quip that in 60 they said I got in too early. In 64 they said I got out too soon, and in 68 I've done both. I mean, he was in and out. He just really he wasn't politically comfortable with kind of going all the way in 68. And then by May of 68, Rockefeller, thanks to his foreign policy aide, Harvard professor Henry Kissinger, was making some pretty critical speeches of Johnson on Vietnam, and that kind of ended that what could have blossomed there between Rockefeller and Johnson. And I think at that point, Johnson gradually begins to shift more toward the Nixon column. The Johnson people told me, Johnson believed to be president, you had to have a killer instinct. Mm-hmm. And by that, I think they mean, the president is the commander in chief. You need to be able to make life and death decisions potentially at a moment's notice, unemotionally, based on incomplete evidence, and of course, imperfect timing. And Johnson just didn't feel that Humphrey was sort of presidential timber. And Nixon by May is beginning to make pretty, progressive speeches about domestic policy. Ultimately, so take the Great Society or the War on Poverty. Nixon is taking those ideas, but he's kind of shading them in a Republican way. And by that, I mean, instead of talking about massive welfare spending piled on top of massive welfare spending, he's talking about black tax cuts and investments in cities and encouraging the growth of private businesses and home ownership credits. All kind of coded in that Republican language, but the purpose is the same. Spending levels, as many Republicans who would criticize Nixon later, didn't go down during the Nixon presidency. The size of government grew, after the Great Society. So I think after a series of events, Johnson came to fall into the Nixon column, believing that he would be a better successor on the Vietnam War, which was the weakest part of Johnson's legacy, of course, but also even on domestic spending, Nixon ultimately no more ended the Great Society than Eisenhower did the New Deal when Eisenhower came in.
So that's a good point on the kind of influence that Eisenhower still has. You make a statement at one point in the book that Lyndon Johnson very much wanted to be what Eisenhower was to him to the next president. And at that point, it seems like it's going to be Richard Nixon. Now, you draw this relationship together, you really piece it together, you really give color to it by accessing some archives and some papers and kind of recovering the memories of some key figures that we really haven't talked about in the context of the 68 race, specifically Billy Graham in his role as kind of interlocutor between the Nixon camp and the Johnson camp. Tell me a little bit about, one, the Billy Graham papers, which seem like a wonderful research resource for anyone looking at this period. And then two, how you saw those two camps coming together thanks to Billy Graham?
Well, this is one element where, I wish I could say I was so brilliant I could have anticipated going down this road. As a researcher, when you go down the rabbit hole, you have a general sense of the direction you're going to go, but you don't know how things are going to unfold. And for me, so I don't know how many books have been written about 68, but this is the first one that has kind of official cooperation from all four of those sides I mentioned. I mean, Johnson, Humphrey, Nixon, and Wallace. And I talked to about 85 of the family and staffers, pretty much everybody who's still around. And one in particular, this was December of 2017, I was meeting with former Vice President Walter Mondale, who's the one who kind of put me on this path ultimately. And a really interesting conversation. And he encouraged me to really focus on LBJ, that it's wrong to exclude him. And you need to focus on LBJ's mindset throughout that year. And I asked Mondale toward the end of our meeting, I said, he said, well, you want to know what I think, my bottom line. So Mondale was co-chair of Humphrey's campaign in 68, which I sometimes know is more of a ceremonial duty than a substantive one. But what I didn't know, Mondale said, Humphrey and I became very close in the 1970s. And we talked many times about 68. And I felt almost as if talking to him in 2017, I was kind of getting Humphrey's side or take, on the 68 election. And Mondale said, if you want to know what I think, Lyndon Johnson absolutely did not want Hubert Humphrey to win in 1968. And he said that, he repeated it, he said it twice. And that goes against shelves of books. I mean, that is a central tenet of the conventional wisdom of 68. And I said, well, what could you possibly mean? Do you think that Johnson wanted Nixon to win? And he kind of paused, and we were at his law firm in Minneapolis, and he looked back at me and he said, maybe. And so, but that really gave me a challenge to how do it's difficult as a writer to write about someone who wasn't a writer. I mean, Lyndon Johnson had lots of tapes and left other records, but as far as we know, he didn't keep a diary. He didn't write extensive correspondence and memoranda. I mean, we have other ways of getting at that, tapes, Lady Bird's diary, there's other sources that help. But 2 months after the meeting with Mondale, I recall a headline that the Reverend Billy Graham died. This is February of 2018 at age 99. And that triggered a process that continues to this day of opening his really massive kind of 70 years of personal papers in Charlotte, North Carolina, where there's the Billy Graham Library, the museum, and now they're building up the archive it's almost like a presidential library in terms of the final resting place. The volume of material is just incredible. And just before the pandemic, there was a brief window of openness where the Grahams allowed me generously to access and to cite the Graham Diary. The Graham Diary, or the VIP notebooks, as he called it, some parts of it are called a diary. It's kind of a hybrid diary scrapbook. Some parts are handwritten, some parts are dictated and typed later. Sometimes he went to a lunch at the White House and he scratched some notes on the back of the menu that the president might have said to him during the conversation during the lunch. And he stuffed it in, to the scrapbook and the diary. And because Graham lived to be so long, to age 99, it's 50 some volumes of material that begins with Harry Truman in 1950 and goes to Barack Obama in 2014. And I would say it documents his relationships with presidents from Truman to Obama, with their families and top staff. And it contains verbatim content with those presidents that I've never seen anywhere else. No presidential library, not in the National Archives. And for the 1960s, there's a chapter in the book that I call Messenger, because it really, I think that captures what Graham's role was in the 68 election, where he is an intermediary, a back channel, a messenger, whatever term you prefer, between not just Johnson and Nixon, but also to Humphrey, because the first headquarters of his ministry was in Minneapolis back in the late 1940s, to President Eisenhower, who was really the first president he knew really well, I think personally, even to Wallace, who he called one of the greatest orators of the 20th century. And so I estimated that Graham knew almost all of these figures, an average of 20 years by 1968, as he was reaching the peak of his profession and they were reaching theirs. And so what you see, there's this, so I document a number of these messages that go back and forth in the book. And the most interesting one I find is just after Labor Day which is the traditional kickoff of the high season of the campaign, about 3 months before Americans go to the polls. And Graham carries a message to the Oval Office, to LBJ's Oval Office from Nixon. And it's this 6-point pledge, quite speculative about what a President Nixon would do, how he would treat a former President Johnson. And you made a point earlier, which was good. Eisenhower was the model at this point for what a post-president does. You don't serve on corporate boards, you don't give big expensive speeches, you write books, and you give private advice to your successors. Democrat or Republican makes no difference. You have a property, you deed to the American people. There's a farm in Gettysburg. And I think Johnson wanted to be to his successor that what Eisenhower had been to Johnson during the tumultuous 1960s. Because, of course, that tumultuous period wasn't going to be over when Johnson left the White House. Whoever was going to be president was going to be in for a rough ride, in the very late 60s and early 70s. And that multi-point pledge that Graham carried to Johnson in the Oval Office just after Labor Day in 1968 was that this came at a time when many in Johnson's own party were criticizing him for Vietnam, but also, as I said, negative consequences of the Great Society, crime, unrest, and so forth. That Nixon would give credit for Johnson when Vietnam War is all over because he just said he deserves it. He's the hardest working president in 140 years, which was a direct appeal to one of LBJ's political heroes, Andrew Jackson, that he would consult with him in retirement. He would give him sort of prestigious duties as a former president, including to foreign countries, and that Nixon would do everything he could to give Johnson a good place in history. And that's exactly what Johnson wanted to hear at a moment when many in his own party were criticizing him. I think this is just incredible. I don't know if with social media, this kind of thing could have been kept a secret today. I mean, Nixon hands Johnson all the ammunition he needs at that point to blow up the Nixon campaign, unless, of course, he goes along with it.
Brilliant calculation on Nixon's part. And as you point out, a very different strategy than what you might see today. So let's move past Humphrey for a little bit, because we've gotten so much from Nixon and Johnson. And take me, this is probably something you want to hear from your wife, but you're going to hear it from me. Take me to Paris. Take me to the Vietnam peace talks. But also tell me a little bit about that story we've heard for decades, the Chenault affair, and Nixon's role in blowing up those peace talks to help mastermind an election win. You have a very different take on those two things, and really on the role of Vietnam and the election in general.
Yeah, I say at the outset of the book that much of the story of this campaign has been told two different ways, really by both critics of Nixon, but also by his defenders, who are fewer in number, but it still is a feature of a number of books. And the critics say that Nixon used this Washington socialite, Anna Chenault, who, as a kind of intermediary to pass a message to South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu that don't take part in Lyndon Johnson's peace talks or any last-minute effort to end the Vietnam War, because under a President Nixon, you'll get a better deal. And that's been, this is called the Chenault affair, named for her. And this has been on the public record since January of 1969 in the St. Louis Globe-Dispatch, is the newspaper that broke it. And it's come and gone, a few times. It pops up for a while, then it goes away. And it's really been a prominent feature in our kind of memory of this election since 2016. It's really taken off, believe it or not. And my take is different. And before I get to that, I'll back up a little bit. Anna Chenault it's been written up that she was kind of a Nixon insider, a serious, dedicated Republican, and she fundraised for Nixon and for others. And I would say so much of this, I think, is just not correct. Her husband, her deceased husband, was General Claire Chenault, kind of the famous Army general during World War II, liaison to Chiang Kai-shek, even after he fled the mainland of China after the 1949 Civil War in China. And she was Chinese. I mean, she grew up in Shanghai, and her family had already lost everything to communist takeover in the late 1940s and understood what the stakes were. And so she had a very hardline anti-communist position on Vietnam. She understood, she believed that Truman lost China. She believed the U.S. got tired in Korea and abandoned Park in South Korea. And she believed that eventually Americans would get tired and go home in Vietnam, and we would abandon a third ally, which is, Americans, we get in these far-flung adventures around the world, and eventually we get tired and we come home. And so she was very hardline, but if anything, I would say she was a conservative Democrat. Her husband was from Louisiana. He was a conservative Democrat. The only political issue I think she had really was anti-communism. When she came to Washington, she was a proud Kennedy supporter. She got a presidential appointment from President Kennedy. She had more access to the Johnson White House than any other White House, not a Republican, in terms of state dinners and official events with visiting dignitaries. And so in 1968, I think she kind of attached herself to the strongest anti-communist. She'd been all the way with Johnson and Humphrey, but when they started to waver in 1967 and 1968, Nixon looked like a better alternative. And so there's two versions of this. The critics of Nixon have said that Nixon used her to steal the election in 1968, and that effectively is the Chennault affair. And the defenders of Nixon say, no, it was Johnson who tried to steal the election from Nixon, who would have won, in order for him to help Humphrey get over the finish line. And basically in the book is I reject both takes. I think the peace talks explain a lot. When in May of 1968, Johnson calls for peace talks, and Johnson is criticized just like Nixon 4 years later for, he could have ended the war earlier if he wanted to and saved unknown numbers of American dead, who knows, a much bigger number of Vietnamese dead. And it's a nice theory, except for the fact that in 1968, the only people who wanted out of the war were Americans. These were called peace talks, but let's not fool ourselves. These weren't peace talks. The war was going to continue after Americans withdrew. It was really about Americans negotiating the terms for unilateral American military withdrawal. What happened after we were gone? Well, that's up to them. There was no wider peace plan for what used to be called the Indochina region with Cambodia and Laos. We tried that several times, and it didn't. Geneva Accords back to 1954, the Laos Accords in 1962. Each time it didn't work, and it didn't work because the North Vietnamese, I believe, planned to fill the void left by the French and take over militarily by conquest the entire former Indochina area with the help of the Soviets and the Chinese. And so in 1968, we called them the peace talks, and they began meeting in Paris the second week of May. Our ally, South Vietnam, wasn't even a party of the talks. These were talks just between the Americans and the North Vietnamese. The South Vietnamese eventually had a liaison and were brought into the talks officially under the Nixon administration. But even the idea to call them peace talks, is a misnomer. It might make us feel better, about our intentions, but it doesn't make them peace talks. So I think you follow from May, and then they drag on. Nothing much gets accomplished. And by October of 1968, I think Lyndon Johnson's getting worried. He's getting worried that no matter what happens with the peace talks, they're going to be used for political purposes. And he's going to be blamed for, I would say, trying to find peace in Vietnam according to American domestic political timing. The Humphrey people were never going to give Johnson credit for helping him or doing enough. That whatever Johnson did that looked like it might help Humphrey, the Republicans would criticize Johnson. He was really in an impossible position as we get to the eve of the election.
So let's zoom back into earlier in the election, the convention. It's probably the one thing that every high school history student learns about the year 1968, in addition to the assassinations, is the convention in Chicago, the violence that took place in Chicago. We have the traditional cast of characters headlined by Abby Hoffman and Mayor Daley. You also have a different take on the convention and who was really pulling the strings and who was, really the most powerful player in that whole conversation. So tell me a little bit about how you see the convention as kind of a hinge point in the election season.
Well, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and here it is, we find ourselves in a fascinating moment where the Democrats are going back to Chicago in 2024. There's a candidate running named Robert Kennedy. The Republicans are desperate to claw back the White House, but are worried that their nominee could take them the wrong direction. And we have a moderate Democratic president that who's being pressured by activists in his party to step aside and let someone else run. And whether it's 1968 or 2024, all these things are true.
History really does rhyme.
It's really uncanny. And I think for millions of Americans, the way that they experienced the year 1968, especially young people, was through their living rooms on television, whether it be the assassinations of King and Kennedy, whether it be the violence in more than 100 cities that erupted over the course of that summer, or whether it be the convention in August in Chicago, which was just a wild scene on the streets of Chicago outside of the Hilton there on Michigan Avenue, where the police even participated in the violence at sometimes, where Mayor Daley, I think, goaded the protesters to attack his police, and he was planning to defend his city, as he saw. This was Daley's Chicago. And so, my take is different, because I was struck by this. Historians, my daughter's 9.5, and I think sometimes she thinks being a historian is a bit like Indiana Jones or something, but it's actually much less interesting most of the time. We're good at piecing together records and telling stories like a puzzle. You never get all of the pieces of the puzzle. You can't look at the box and sheet and figure out what the final image is supposed to look like that you're building toward. But you have to talk to people. You can't rely on 50-year-old memories in this case, but people can tell you enormously valuable things and help you to triangulate information and records. And I was struck by Jim Jones and others who were close to Johnson in 68, who said, when that convention was going on, we were down at the ranch. And Jim Jones, our later ambassador, a member of Congress from Oklahoma, kind of a Johnson-type Democrat from Oklahoma, our later ambassador to Mexico, told me my job sitting at the ranch was to get the president to Chicago for that convention. The question, of course, is what was Johnson going to do at the convention in Chicago? We now know that there were even drafts of a nomination acceptance speech that was going around. Some people said he just wanted to go there and be a factor in the convention. Some wanted to go and say he just wanted to celebrate his birthday. He turned 60 years old on the day in Chicago when the nomination was supposed to take place, just as in his birthday was also in 64 in Atlantic City on the day of the nomination. The convention was held late in 68 because it was presumed that Johnson would be the nominee. And after he withdrew, he didn't change it. He made a commitment to his friend Daley to hold the convention there. And so I think this is one of these questions that I feel like I don't answer 100% in the book, because it's not clear to me. Was Johnson going to go and be a presence, like an FDR in 40, getting a third term, which was an unprecedented situation in 1940? Was it to celebrate a birthday? Was it to allow a draft Johnson movement to take hold? Possibly. I think there's evidence for that as well. And so Jones told me we were going to the convention until the moment we were not going to the convention. And so Johnson controlled all the strings, the purse strings, the budget, the platform, basically mirrored his Vietnam policy. The poor Humphrey people had to line up with members of the public for seats in the gallery and the convention in the International Amphitheater. I mean, this was still Johnson's convention, even though he was not on the ballot. He wanted to make clear for everyone that he was the president for at least 4 or 5 more months, and he was in charge during that remainder of that time.
Okay, my 2 takeaways from that are it's Johnson's convention, and we really need to do more to make people think that historians are like Indiana Jones. But let's turn to the other convention down in Miami Beach, where Nixon accepts the nomination. But there's some politics going on in that convention as well. And you're sitting here, of course, at the namesake of the 40th president of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Reagan has a role to play in 68 as well. Can you tell me a little about Reagan's role to play?
I would say that the most important point is it was not a foregone conclusion that Nixon was going to win that nomination. I mean, don't forget how much of a loser Nixon was as of 68. He'd lost in 60 narrowly to Kennedy and Johnson. He'd lost more decisively for the California governorship in 1962, which now in hindsight, I think he seemed very ill-suited to run for, given the fact that he already had he was locked into national policy after being Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years, and initially it was Michigan Governor George Romney who was running away. I mean, Romney's one of those figures, a bit like Nelson Rockefeller or a Kennedy. To me, he looked like a president. You know, he had the good looks, the kind of chiseled features. He had the money. He had the success story in private business, but then also in Michigan. Michigan back then, it's still an important state today, but it was even more important back then with the big three automakers driving kind of the engine of the economy for so many decades in this country. And then Romney fizzled out, really even before the New Hampshire primary. And I think real conservatives, sort of Goldwater conservatives, there's a few still around, believe it or not. And you talk to them about 64, the Goldwater campaign, and you'd think they won in 1964. I mean, they happily went over the cliff with Barry Goldwater. And for them, it was a victory because finally they nominated a conservative. And after Nixon in 60 and then Eisenhower, before that Dewey, they'd always wanted a conservative. And so for them, it was a kind of victory in 64. They weren't thrilled about Nixon in 68. I think he had shaded a little more to the right, versus his 60 form. He was set up kind of in the center lane of the Republican Party. With you've got Reagan to his right, you've got Rockefeller to his left, kind of conceding that center lane to Nixon in 1968. And so I think the understanding, I think it was between, and there's a lot of records that haven't been opened yet in the Reagan Library and in the Nixon Library. My view of the understanding between California Governor Ronald Reagan and former Vice President Richard Nixon in 1968 was that Republican leaders were a bit more pragmatic. They wanted to win in 1968. They didn't want to get wiped out again the way they did in 1964. And I think the Reagan people and Rockefeller to a degree were waiting for Nixon to make a major mistake. Of course, a major mistake that never came. And beginning in New Hampshire, he rolled up huge decisive victories in all the primaries through Oregon. He didn't want to compete head to head with Reagan in California, being a favorite son. That was Reagan territory in 1968. And so I think Reagan was kind of looking over the shoulder, maybe a bit like Gavin Newsom looking over the shoulder of Joe Biden today, and ready to move in if he needs to.
You know, that's interesting. And one of the things I wrote in the margins of your book was, could Nixon have won if Goldwater, could Nixon have won in 68 if Goldwater hadn't lost in 64? At least in the party nomination. It certainly got me thinking. I won't put you on the spot of having to answer that question, though. If you want to answer it at the end, you're more than welcome to answer that question at the end. But let's kind of start to wrap things up here. I want your take on why Humphrey lost and why Nixon won, right? And we've covered a little bit of why Nixon won and how he won, but we also haven't really gotten into the meat of why Humphrey lost. But why did Nixon win? Why did Humphrey lose? Why did Nixon win?
Well, I guess my take on that was the Republicans also had, an awkward coalition. I mean, you had kind of Eastern establishment, kind of liberal Republicans, to use that term. You had more conservatives. I mean, Strom Thurmond dramatically switched parties in 64. Ronald Reagan had around the same time. Millions of Southern Democrats were either becoming Republicans, it's kind of the beginning of that massive political shift that was about to take place, or at least they were already voting split ticket. And they might, beginning with Eisenhower, they might have voted for Republican for president, but then Democrat the rest of the ticket, especially in the South. In the statewide, they consider themselves Democrats, but not the National Democratic Party, as they called it. Why did Nixon win? I think Nixon was not I would say Nixon was not anyone's favorite or first choice, but he was a compromise that could make everyone happy. So if the conservatives were not going to get their Reagan or their Goldwater, they were willing to live with a Reagan. The liberals who wanted a Rockefeller or a Romney weren't going to get a Rockefeller or a Romney, but they were willing to live with a Nixon. So he was sort of the compromise in the center lane of the Republican Party. But I think also more than that, if there's one thing Republicans and Democrats agreed on in 1968, it was ending the chaos. It was turning the noise level down, which is what Nixon promised to do. Voting for Nixon was a bit like having a time machine and kind of going back to the 1950s. Nixon wasn't tied to the Vietnam War. He wasn't tied to domestic unrest throughout the country. And therefore, he wouldn't defend those as policies. So I think for many people, I think that was the answer. Why did Humphrey lose? Or to reverse the question, some people will say, well, what could Humphrey have done to have won, to have gotten across the finish line in 1968? And I think one thing he could have done was he could have had, say, an outgoing Texas Governor John Connally as his running mate. Because if Humphrey could have divided the conservative vote, that could have helped him. If you could have more of the Johnson moderates pull the lever for Humphrey. And again, I would point to the intervention of Billy Graham in terms of, from what I've discovered so far, Graham intervened with Connally at the convention in Chicago and said, if you stay off the ticket. Now, I don't know that Humphrey and Connally would have gone on the ticket, but he was on the short list. And it was, I think, a way Humphrey could have won if he'd had Connally on that ticket. And Graham said, if you stay off the ticket under a Nixon presidency, Nixon will offer you a cabinet appointment. And that was as good as putting LBJ, in your government, which Nixon did in 1971, making Connally Treasury Secretary. And so I think Humphrey was ultimately too tied to the chaos of the decade. Nixon was clearly not. And so I think voters in both parties didn't necessarily like who their nominee was, but they wanted security, they wanted safety, and they wanted to turn the noise level down. And I think Nixon provided the best vehicle in order to do that.
Well, you're really making 1968 out to be 2024, it seems. But let's wrap up. And what I want to do to wrap up is this. What is the one archive or kind of research resource that you were most kind of enthralled with, or you think has the most utility for other people who want to write books on this subject or others? And what's the project that you're looking forward to doing next, writing next, even if you need a little downtime after producing such a great book here?
Well, I mean, I call myself an archive rat. I travel 100 nights a year of spending time in archives or doing interviews. I mean, the writing of history for me is a full contact sport in terms of interviews, traveling to historic sites and archives. And what I really do, I think that other historians don't do necessarily, is really stay on top of what's newly released. It might be, in this case, 55 years old to the rest of us, but for historians, this is brand new. And the feeling that a historian has of kind of accessing records for the first time or seeing something that very few people have seen before you is simply exhilarating. The acquisition of new knowledge and then the ability to disseminate that to other people. I think I'm going to go back to Billy Graham here, for the second part of your question. The Graham archive is just incredible. It's going to be many years until this is fully open. This is not just the history of what we now would call the evangelical movement. This is not just the history of the formation of what we called in the 1980s of the religious right, the moral majority. This is presidential history and political history. Graham was deeply connected on both sides of the aisle to moderates, especially. So Eisenhower, Johnson, Nixon, and more recently, I would say Reagan, Ford. I did not have access to those. We're talking 50-some volumes of diaries. This isn't going to spawn a book. This is going to spawn many books, given the degree and depth of verbatim content that's in these records. This is an archive to keep an eye on for those inclined. Anything to do with kind of the intersection of religion and politics and policy, this is the archive to be at. And then in terms of what I'm doing next, I am not the kind of writer to say, here's the book, this is all we know, about a topic. I think my job is to start a conversation. And that's what I try to do with this book. I don't know whether I certainly there are questions I couldn't answer. I don't know whether I've got every single little detail right. I think I've got it more right than wrong in terms of my take on this election. And so to me, then that sets up a fascinating research question, which is what we historians grapple with. What we wakes us up at 3:00 in the morning and we can't sleep, and this is what we think about. If Johnson depended on liberal support in 64, was proud to have Humphrey on his ticket at the height of the civil rights era, and then in 68, based on this book, they were barely on speaking terms. The conservatives and the liberals, what in the world happened during those 4 years? And I think the conventional wisdom would say, well, Vietnam. I think it was much more than that. I think Johnson inherited a party from Kennedy that was much more divided than we realized. I think Southerners resented the fact that the Kennedys largely brought the elites in Harvard into policymaking and were beginning to push conservatives out of the party like Johnson. And so the next project is, as long as I don't put myself in the grave doing it, because it's an even bigger one, is John's LBJ White House years. So if I stay on track here at a different archive just about every week, maybe late 2026, I will have a book sitting on a table like this.
Okay, so we'll have you on in 2026. We'll book the date right now for another podcast. Well, so pleased to have you on the show, really kicking things off in a strong way for Rendezvous with History. And make sure you have a rendezvous with Professor Nichter's new book, The Year That Broke Politics. Thank you.
Thanks. My pleasure.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's scholarly initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.